Good evening, everybody. Thanks for your patience. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Roisin White and I'm a Communications Executive here at Fingal County Council. And I'll be your host for this evening's webinar, which is the second of the public webinars as part of the public consultation on aircraft noise. Tonight we'll present the draft regulatory decision of the Aircraft Noise Competent Authority. This webinar will be recorded and that recording will become available on our website in the coming days. There you'll also find a recording of our first webinar, which took place on November 17th of last year. And we have a further event scheduled for early February, which we'll explain and promote to you at the end of this session if you'd like to join us for that one also. This public consultation began back on November 11th and will end on February 28th of this year, a total period of 14 weeks. This lengthy period is designed to allow as many people as possible who have an interest in the consultation to come forward and make a submission, and we would very much welcome your submissions as well as your interest in the draft decision. Submissions can be made by individuals as well as groups such as associations or commercial or residents associations who might wish to bring their views together as one group, and we would sincerely welcome your views on every aspect of the draft regulatory decision. You can share those views at www.consult.fingal.ie, where you'll find all of the documentation relating to this consultation. We'll begin in just a few minutes with a short presentation from Etna Felton, who's the Director of ANCA, followed by Joe Mann, who's ANCA Senior Engineer, and then we'll move on to a question and answer session. This evening you'll have the opportunity to speak with a number of members of the ANCA team, including our outside consultants on noise and environmental issues who have joined us online and are ready to answer your queries. If you have a query throughout the event, please enter it into the Q&A box, which you should find on the right hand of your screen. We'll endeavour to answer as many questions as possible. Based on our first event, we expect to have quite a high volume of questions this evening. As many people may ask similar questions on a given topic, you might find that we'll amalgamate questions or paraphrase them. This isn't intended in any way to remove the intent of your question, but just to help us get through as many of them as possible, as we know everyone is keen to have their query answered. If you don't hear your exact wording read aloud, please be assured that a transcript of your exact wording will be provided to the project team, and they will have the opportunity to read every one of your comments after the event. In the very unlikely event that we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us and we'll resolve them as quickly as possible. If there is an outage of the webinar and we go offline for a moment, please check your email, as the email you use to register it will be how we'll contact you to bring you back into the meeting. Thank you very much for joining us. As I said, our presentation will now begin and we'll start with a short video.
With a new North Runway, Dublin Airport is returning to growth after the COVID pandemic. This growth is good for the economy, but aircraft noise is a serious issue for local communities. As regulator, ANCA has carefully assessed the DAA's planning application. We've concluded that measures are needed to mitigate the effects of aircraft noise on local communities and the environment, especially at night. So we propose directing the planning authority to include certain conditions when deciding on the DAA's application. Condition 1, a noise quota scheme. This works like a noise budget. Each aircraft is allocated a number of points, a quota count, which it spends based on the level of noise it produces. Planes with a high quota count will not be able to take off or land between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. A total quota of 16,260 points is proposed for Dublin Airport. Condition 2, restricted flight activity between midnight and 6 a.m., although both runways may be used immediately before and after this period. This should cut down the noise so that locals can sleep better. Condition 3, a new residential sound insulation grant scheme. For households exposed to the highest levels of aircraft noise, this will provide finance to insulate their bedrooms. These measures balance the needs of the community with Dublin Airport's sustainable development, and we need you to tell us what you think in our 14-week consultation process. Review our proposals at consult.fingal.ie and visit the ANCA website at fingal.ie/aircraftnoiseCA.
Some of you may not know who ANCA is because we're relatively new, and I suppose this webinar is to talk about our first public consultation. We're the independent regulator for aircraft noise at Dublin Airport. We were established in 2019 by Fingal County Council on foot of new legislation and on an EU regulation. We have a number of responsibilities related to Dublin Airport. First of all, we regulate the management of aircraft noise at Dublin Airport. We also ensure that aircraft noise is assessed in accordance with EU and Irish legislation. And currently there are no noise operating restrictions at Dublin Airport. But in future, when they are in place, it will be our role to monitor them for compliance. And finally, we review all proposals for development at Dublin Airport. if there's any aspect of a planning permission or a planning application that could cause additional aircraft noise. And actually, that's why we're here today. So we've received a planning application submitted by Dublin Airport Authority. And at the moment, as I mentioned, there's no limit on the number of flights or hours of operation at Dublin Airport. However, the planning conditions for the new North Runway will put some limitations in place. And the application submitted by DAA looks to change 2 of these conditions. So we have undertaken technical studies to reach a draft decision, and that's what's now out for public consultation. So just to give a sense of the process we executed on our review, after ANCA received the Dublin Airport Authority's planning application, we carried out a thorough technical assessment of the aircraft noise aspects of it. We engaged international experts because this is quite a specialist field. And the experts bring to the table, aircraft noise management expertise, and they have helped us to assess the current and future noise environment at Dublin Airport. As part of the process, we've consulted with other relevant authorities, including the DAA themselves, to ensure that our recommendations are practical. So following our detailed analysis, we've come up with a number of conditions, and these make up our draft decision. These recommendations will reduce the impact of aircraft noise on surrounding communities, while also providing for Dublin Airport to continue as an essential service for all of us who use it, and also as a major employer and driver of Ireland's national economy. So first of all, we're proposing a noise abatement objective for the airport. The DAA will achieve the noise abatement objective by adhering to the 3 new conditions that we are recommending in this public consultation, and I'll explain each of these. So the noise abatement objective is the first of its kind in Ireland. It's a long-term plan to ensure best management of aircraft noise at the airport. It considers the common good of all impacted stakeholders, like now and into the future. It will also guide future decisions that are needed to manage the aircraft noise aspects of the operations at Dublin Airport. So this will serve to dramatically reduce the impact of aircraft noise in the long term. And in fact, it will reduce the aircraft noise at Dublin Airport by 50% in 2040 compared to the 2019 noise levels. In terms of the 3 conditions I referred to, we want to introduce a noise quota system or a noise budget for nighttime operations at Dublin Airport. Each aircraft is assigned a quota number using internationally recognized methods. So we're recommending that Dublin Airport be given a noise quota budget of 16,260 each year. And really, to put this into context, that's somewhat similar to the amount of nighttime noise that the airport generated in 2019 before the COVID pandemic. As part of the noise quota scheme, we're also recommending that aircraft with higher noise quota counts will not be permitted to take off or land between 11 and 7 a.m. So aircraft, as I mentioned, are assigned a noise quota number ranging from 0 for very small or quiet aircraft, right up to 16 for the noisiest aircraft. Each time an aircraft lands or takes off, the airport's noise quota budget is used according to the noise quota number of that particular aircraft. For the second condition, we propose to restrict flights on the new North Runway between midnight and 6 a.m. The existing permission refers to this operating mode as 7B. Some of you are familiar with that. So this will reduce the impact of noise on all of the communities in the airport locality and provide certainty as to how nighttime operations will work on the runways. So we're also recommending a new residential sound insulation grant scheme for residents most affected by nighttime noise from Dublin Airport and who have not previously availed of such a grant. This is a map of the eligible residents who will be entitled to grants of up to 20,000 to insulate bedrooms against aircraft noise. And I suppose just for the detail of it, this is available on our consultation website. So in terms of what's happening next, what we're recommending to the public is now out for public consultation. That began last November, as you may know, and it continues on until the 28th of February. The consultation portal contains our reports and we strongly invite you to make a submission. We're also going to be holding another webinar later on in February. And certainly we're available for any questions that anybody might have. So I would encourage everybody to partake in this public consultation and give your views. And thank you very much for your attention.
We're now going to go to Joe Mann for a few extra words before we move on to the Q&A. Joe?
Thank you. I'll just take the opportunity to give a very quick overview of our consultation portal for anybody that's not familiar with it that may want to interact with it and make a submission. So this the consultation portal, as our slide has started showing, we'll provide at the end, is consult.fingal.ie. This is the consultation portal for all public consultations by Fingal County Council. Ours is the aircraft noise consultation, and in there we have uploaded all the documents associated with our decision and the proposals that we're putting out to hear everybody's views on. So we have an overview of on the homepage of how to make a submission and how to participate, and hopefully that will give people the information to make the submission. There is also an overview of the planning application itself, and for anybody that wants more detail on any aspect of the application itself, they can go to the website of the Planning Authority for that. We also have the noise abatement objective for Dublin Airport, and we have a supporting report in there that people may wish to read to show to inform the proposals that we've made. We are carrying out a strategic environmental assessment and an appropriate assessment of our noise abatement objective and our draft regular decision, and the information is in those relevant chapters as well. We then have the draft regular decision itself and the related report, and there are a significant number of appendices supporting those reports, and those documents are all available to read and to download. We also have an interactive map where people can go in and they can put your air code or your address and find out exactly in relation to your home what the projected noise exposure will be, both with or without our draft regulation. It will also be possible to have a look at the noise insulation and whether you may qualify for it by looking at those maps. So I would encourage anybody to very strongly encourage people to participate through this. It will also allow you to look at submissions that other people have made, and hopefully all the information that you need will be in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, for that overview. So before we move into Q&A, just a couple of reminders. If you just keep popping your questions into the Q&A box as we go here, we can see a number of them starting to arrive already. Again, if you wouldn't mind trying to phrase your question as a question rather than a statement, it just makes it a little bit easier for us to figure out who's best to answer it. And as I said, we'll endeavour to get through as many as possible in the time that we have allotted. We intend to be here till 8 p.m. So as you can see, we've quite a lot of time left to go, an hour and 15 minutes, and we'll get through lots of questions in that time. So to kick off our Q&A session, we're going to move to our first question, which we've seen coming in from a number of people, and it's something that's been commented on in some of the submissions, which is, why are we doing this now? And for that, I'm going to go to Angela Dullahan, who's our planning consultant.
Thank you, Roisin. Yes, there have been changes in European legislation in Regulation 598 in 2014 and new Irish legislation in the 2019 Act. And we understand that planning permission has been granted in the past and went through a long process, but their airports are permitted to apply again, and the new legislation has given the need to review certain aspects, see if there are different approaches that might work better in the current circumstances, and ANCA was established in 2019 to carry out these assessments. Regular noise assessments are required under the legislation where a noise problem is identified, and the starting point of the legislation is that there shall be no undue interference in European travel. other than is necessary to permit efficient operation of a European airport. So we carry out an assessment which sets out a framework for the management of noise, and those elements which we consider in the assessment are those that are required in the balanced approach, which we will give more detail on in a bit later on. And in addition, there have been changes in population around the airport, and there have been new advances in new technology, which we need to take into account in that assessment of the balanced approach. Thank you, Roisin.
Thanks very much for that question, Angela, and for answering it. So to move on to our second question that we've just had coming here in the chat box, is there an adequate number of noise monitors? I'm going to put that question to Joe, if you wouldn't mind, Joe.
This is something that we have been interacting with the airport over the last number of years. We have listened, a lot of people have told us that they would like to have better access to live information, and we're engaging with the airport on this at the moment. We would hope in the near future to be able to significantly deliver a larger number of noise measuring stations in the community. This will do two things. It will allow people to see the live and historical noise information for their area and to be able to make informed decisions. And it will also allow both ourselves and the airport to better validate the noise models and to make sure that forecasted noise, when it comes to the time of the noise happening, that we can better validate the models and make sure that the noise better relates to the actual noise. So yeah, that's something that we hope to. It's not part of this process, but it's something that we're working on and we hope to have progress on.
Thanks, Joe, for that. So to go to another question that's coming in the chat, which is, has ANCA done any work to see how the real world noise of planes using Dublin Airport correlates with the QC values that have been assigned to them by international best practice? I'd like to go to James Trow on that one. James, if you wouldn't mind taking that question, please.
Sure, yeah, can do. So we can't have regard for the noise levels produced by the planes themselves in terms of setting restrictions on aircraft types through the Quota system. The regulations that we're working under mean that we can't do that, and that's not possible. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't require the DAA to ensure that any modelling that is undertaken as part of compliance assessments against the NAO isn't validated, and that would entail measurements around the airports to ensure that there is a correlation between their noise modelling and what is presented in the noise contours.
Thanks very much, James. To go to another question that's come in on the chat, somebody's asked, is there a soundproofing scheme for members clubs in the noise zone? Ethna, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Roisin. Essentially, the scheme we're including in this relates specifically to nighttime noise, and therefore it is for residential premises only, in particular bedrooms. Some of the previous schemes did include additional buildings, for example, schools, but there's nothing specifically outlined for clubs as such.
Thank you, Ethna. To move on to the next question, are you responsible for overseeing when planes leave the environmental corridor early? I'd like to put that question to James first, and James, if you'd like to bring anybody else in, please do.
I would say it's probably one for Joe, because it relates back to the noise monitoring part and the track keeping aspects.
Yeah, the Airport Authority has a responsibility under the legislation for ensuring that all airport users comply with all noise mitigation measures in place for the airport, and the environmental corridors are one of those measures. They have a requirement every year to provide us with a compliance report on all the noise mitigation measures, and the compliance reports for the last 2 years are published on our website. If there's anything that's not satisfactory in those reports, ANCA is entitled to ask for additional information and to engage with the airport if there's any noise mitigation measure that's not being complied with. And there we have engaged with the airport on issues such as that over the past couple of years. So the legal responsibility, I suppose to answer the question, the legal responsibility is with the airport to enforce the noise mitigation measures, but we do have an oversight role, and we do engage with the airport on matters such as that.
How will the new runway affect the pattern of flights and which communities will be most affected? And Joe is going to take that question.
As part of assessment, we looked at approximately 12 modes of operation for Dublin Airport. There will effectively be 3 runways in operation at Dublin Airport once the North Runway is completed. The original grant of permission placed a lot of limitations on the shorter crosswind runway, and the airport hasn't applied to change those in any way, and that runway does not form part of our decision in any way. We looked at all the possible ways the runways could be operated, and what we found was the original mode of operation that was set out in the original grant of permission still remains to be the most efficient in terms of the protection of people's health. So what that means was when traffic is landing and taking off into the west, which happens 70% of the time because that's where the prevailing wind comes from, both the north and the south runway can be used for departing traffic depending on the air traffic control's preferences. The existing runway shall be the preferred runway for arriving traffic into the west. And then for 30% of the time when the wind changes and traffic takes off and lands into the east, both runways can be used for arriving traffic, and the south runway, the current runway, is the preferred runway for departing traffic. So in this decision, we have prioritized the protection of people's health. And what our assessment found was that by maintaining that mode of operation was the most effective way of doing that. And the reason that we're opening up the north runway for 2 hours of the night and at the start to the end, it's because, again, our assessment showed that the priority level that we have set in our abatement objective, which is aligned with the advice of the World Health Organization, by using the north runway for those 2 hours of the night, less people are affected by the highest levels of aircraft noise. So that's the reason that we have put that recommendation forward. But we do accept that there are many ways to operate the runways. This was the basis, this was the findings of our assessment. But if people want to suggest different ways of operating the runways, we're more than happy to look at those submissions and to see what the impact would be of them.
Thank you very much, Joe. So we have a question now in regarding quota counts. This person has asked, regarding the quota count, what would be the consequences in terms of operations to the quota count budget being depleted? Would there be movement restrictions on specific aircraft, for example, high QC or all aircrafts? Etna, if you wouldn't mind taking that one.
Yes. So with the quota count, assuming that our quota count number goes through as it is into the planning authority following this public consultation, that will become part of the planning conditions, and as such it is an enforcement issue. So really the airport can't function if they go over their quota count on an annual basis. So what that means is if they see that they're depleting their quota count through the year, they will be forced to manage the quota count system in such a way that they don't spend it all. So the answer to that is they really have to manage it throughout the year and not go over it. Otherwise, it is an enforcement issue and they will have gone against the terms of their planning permission.
Thank you very much, Etna. Pardon me. So we've got a question here from a person who's living in the area. They say, my home appears to be on the edge of the area covered by the map, but noise levels have certainly increased in recent weeks, particularly since November. Joe, can I ask you to respond to that comment?
Yeah, this is an issue that we're hearing a lot in recent times. 2019 was the busiest year ever in Dublin Airport, and when COVID happened in 2020, there was a very, very significant drop off in noise levels. So there has been some restoration of that traffic, and we are hearing a lot of people saying that they're noticing it much more than they had in the past. The question says that people are, at the edge of one of the contours, and that's one of the issues with noise contours. People can be at one side or the other, but in reality, they're experiencing the same amount of noise, and we do understand that. But contour maps is it's the internationally agreed method for carrying out noise assessments, and it allows us to do a number of things. It allows us to compare different scenarios, so we can look at one runway preference versus another by using average contours. We can also compare the evolution of noise over time by doing that. So the reality is that whether you're on one side of the contour or another, if you're very close, you are experiencing the same amount of noise. But we map the aircraft noise wherever it happens. Clontarf here is mentioned, and certainly Clontarf is an area that would be experiencing aircraft noise. So what we have done is we have provided maps both on the consultation page and also on the ANCA web page to show people what the noise exposure is and what it's forecast to be in future years, so that people can make informed decisions, both to enable them to participate here and also to make any other decisions that they want to regarding how noise impacts them. So the contours, it's a requirement of the legislation to map nighttime noise from 45 decibels upwards at nighttime. We've gone one step further. We have required the airport to map the noise down to 40 decibels at night, which is a recommendation of the WHO. So that's one step further that we've gone to make sure that as much noise is available as possible. So the noise maps from 40 decibel at night upwards would be available. But in our decision, we have tried to prioritise the measures for the very highest levels of noise. But that's not to say that people aren't experiencing noise in other areas.
Thanks, Joe. You briefly alluded to it there, but just I'm conscious some can't see the questions as they're coming in. So the question that was asked there that Joe had further referred to was, does your authority cover planes flying over residential areas like Clontarf, as flight paths taken by planes over those areas are also a considerable noise concern? So Joe, can you just clarify the remit of ANCA there? Would areas outside of the noise contour be in our responsibility?
Well, it's reasonably technically possible to map aircraft noise down to either about 45 decibels during the day or 40 decibels at night. And the reason for that is because the ambient noise will make it very difficult to distinguish aircraft activity from other ambient noise activity. But our remit covers aircraft noise wherever it arises. We're not a local or regional, we're a national authority. So our remit covers aircraft noise, but the technicalities, the practicalities of presenting aircraft noise down to lower levels than that is just not possible.
Thank you very much, Joe. So how will the new runway affect the pattern on flights, and which communities will be, pardon me, I've just realised we've actually answered that question already, I think, at the start. How long do you anticipate it'll be before there are noticeable noise reductions at Dublin Airport? And I'm going to put that question to James first.
So if we look at the data that's been submitted by the applicant, and we look at the forecast fleet mix, there is a substantive change in their fleet mix at and around 2030. So what we would expect is, with the application keeping the airport operating at its 32 million passengers per annum, is that we would see an increase in noise as there's a COVID recovery, and then we would begin to see a reduction in aircraft noise exposure from the period 2030 and beyond.
Thanks very much, James. So to move on to the next question that's come in, are noise monitors placed when a plane is greater than 1,000 feet or less than 1,000 feet, i.e. landing and taking off? So, for example, are there noise monitors in swords? Joe, can I ask you to respond to that?
Yeah, it's our expectation that we've conveyed to the airport that when the network of noise measuring terminals are expanded, that there will be at a range of areas, so that there will be some close to the airport and some further out, because people have an entitlement to understand what the noise impact is in their area. We also have an expectation that there will be a number of mobile monitoring stations available. So if communities are expressing concerns that they would like to have information relating to their community and they don't have a noise measuring station in the area, that the airport would be in a position to place a station in that. So our hope is that we'll be able to have a better network in the future that will cover areas closer in and further out, and then be able to respond with mobile stations.
Thanks again, Joe. So the next question we have in is from a participant who's asked, why is the noise quota based on the busiest year the airport has ever had in 2019? Again, I'd like to put that question to Joe, and Joe, if you feel you need to share it with anyone else, please do pass it on to other members of the team also.
What the noise quota does is it quantifies the noise based on the current fleet in 2019. So obviously there's been a very significant reduction in aircraft traffic because of the COVID pandemic. But that the restoration of that activity is expected to happen. I think most forecasts out there are suggesting it will happen. As to when it'll happen will depend on future waves of the pandemic. But forecasts at the moment are suggesting that it could happen by about 2025. So what the noise quota does is it quantifies that and it puts a hard limit on it. And then what we have set out as a first for Dublin Airport is we have set out a hard limit on the amount of noise that can be generated. And then as another first for Dublin Airport, we have set out progressive limits in that noise. So we have to recognise that the fleet is not going to significantly change overnight. So the fleet that's in place today is slightly different to the fleet that was in place a year ago and different again to 2 years ago. But the fleet will be substantially the same for the next short number of years. And we had to quantify what that was, and that's what the QC does. It quantifies it. And then we have set out we've set out progressive reductions in noise exposure that we want to see for the coming years, because we can take two approaches. We can either quantify the activity or we can quantify the noise, and it's a valid opinion to favour one over the other, and that's what we're asking people to do. But what we're saying is we took the approach to quantify the noise and to set the airport on a path of noise reduction as opposed to aircraft reduction. We have seen around Europe that the noisiest possible planes are already being made unwelcome at some airports. And aircraft have a long fleet life, it could be 25 or 30 years. And as the noisiest aircraft become unwelcome at some airports that are prioritising noise, they will find continued life in airports that are measuring activity rather than the noise. So what we're proposing is that Dublin won't be one of those airports. But that's the approach that we've taken. And if anybody wants to propose a different approach, we're very open to that. But to answer the question, the QC quantifies the fleet and the activity that happened before the pandemic.
Thanks, Joe. That was really helpful. So the next question we have in is around the quota count budget, and the person has asked, how was the quota count budget defined? Is it likely to actually lead to the restriction of operations to noisier aircrafts, which could be limited in the planning, as you mentioned in your previous answer? I'm going to put that to James first.
Sure. So the quota budget has been defined by looking across the noise forecasts that were submitted by the DAA, and essentially what we've sought to check and review is how their forecast operations during the nighttime hours between 2300 and 7 in the morning equates to a total budget by allocating what's in their forecasts against the quota count for each of those aircraft and then summing that over the course of a calendar year. Now, that gives us the noise budget, and the consequence of that is that if, for example, the fleet does not improve as the applicant is forecasting, then that would potentially constrain their operation and they would not be able to operate as many aircraft as they have forecast. Likewise, if they have a better fleet, the incentive is there for them to operate more aircraft than what they have forecast. That sits as a restriction, but over the top of that, the wider policy that ANCA has put in place is this progressive reduction in noise exposure over time, which has to be met alongside meeting those restrictions that sit within the planning application or would sit as conditions to a consent of planning.
Thanks very much, James. So the next person has asked, can you describe where the noise monitors are positioned, how close and how distant from the runway they are in tests to determine what QC values are assigned to planes, and how do those positions relate to the affected population around Dublin Airport? James, would you like to come back in on this one again?
So the noise monitors themselves, as I mentioned before, we can't assign a quota count based on the measured noise levels that occur at Dublin Airport. The regulation that we have to operate under, and ANCA has to demonstrate that it has followed the European legislation, is that we can't set restrictions and we can't develop noise management methods which are essentially a form of restriction, either restricting an aircraft in terms of the amount of noise it makes or setting a noise quota without using anything other than the certified noise levels that are brought through for that aircraft, which is essentially assigned to that aircraft irrespective of where it operates from or to. Any localized measurements that are of aircraft, as I mentioned before, are part of the validation of the noise contours, which we see more as a means of tracking progress against the noise abatement objective.
Thanks, James. That commenter has come back in to say, would it not be best to have sufficient noise monitors in place before the planning is granted? Is there anything you'd like to say to that?
It's possibly one for Joe, and we have been, as Joe's mentioned before, we have been working with the DA looking at the number of monitors that are available around Dublin Airport, where they're located, and encouraging more monitors to be installed. And as Joe mentioned before, looking at temporary monitors as well. ANCA does want to see more noise monitoring terminals around the airport.
Joe, is there anything you'd like to add there before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, it's our expectation. We have embarked on a program of work with the airport to make sure that does happen, and it's our expectation that there will be a significantly expanded network of noise monitors in place before the noise gets to the stage of the forecast that we have looked at. So yes, in an ideal world, they would be in place today, but we do have to recognise that we are where we are, and they're not something that can be turned around overnight. But it's our expectation that it will happen in the near future, and it's something that we're working very closely with the airport to get that delivered.
Thanks, Joe. So while we're on the topic of noise quotas, there is a question here also around WHO recommendations. So what standing have the WHO recommendations on aircraft nighttime noise, which state that night noise levels produced by aircraft should be below 45 decibels? James, can I ask you to come in on that one, please?
Sure. So we're very cognizant of the recommendations in the WHO. The WHO guidelines. We have adopted them in terms of the dose response functions that allow us to understand the degree to which people are annoyed or highly sleep disturbed as a result of their exposure to aircraft noise. And this assessment has ensured that data above the guideline values, 45 dBl den and 40 dBl night, has been quantified and used as part of the assessment. With regards to the guideline values themselves, we recognise them, they're very much there, they're stated. However, we also have to recognise that they are based on the concept that nobody should be adversely affected in terms of health and well-being from aircraft noise. And as such, the wider considerations that exist for those types of recommendations for policymakers and regulators, such as ANCA, such as the cost of introducing that as a limit and a restriction, are not present within the guidelines, and that puts those guidelines in a difficult place for ANCA to adopt as a restriction or a form of limit.
Thanks, James, for that clarification. That's very helpful. So we're going to move on to another issue that's been asked about here, which is the balanced approach. Joe, I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, could you say a few words on the balanced approach and describe what that really means for people who maybe are unfamiliar with the term and would like to understand better how ANCA conducts its work?
Yeah, it's the balanced approach is one of the very significant changes that has been part of the legislation since the grant of planning permission was granted 15 years ago for the North Runway. So the process called the balanced approach was established by an organisation that's a subset of the United Nations called ICAO. And they set out the policies and standards for aviation activity across the world, safety, sound, and all aspects of aviation. That process has now been enshrined in European legislation that has direct effect in Ireland, and that legislation was given additional effect through an act in 2019. So what the balanced approach says is it's a structured approach for addressing aircraft noise across the European Union. And I say the European Union because that's what the legislation applies here, but the balanced approach is used across the world too. And what it says was that there should be regular reviews of aircraft noise, but that those reviews should only lead to additional controls if a particular problem is identified at an airport, that problem will be specific to the airport. And there's a 4-step approach, and the first arm of the balanced approach is to see, can you reduce the noise at source? So we looked at that, and this would look at things like fleet evolution, changing standards at an international level will also do that. So we do recognise that the fleet at Dublin Airport is changing for the better over time, but we took the view here in ANCA that that in itself wasn't going to address the issues that the issues of concern that we identified at Dublin Airport. So the next stage is to look at land use planning. Land zoning is the primary one here, and we're very supportive of the approach that the Planning Authority has taken here in Fingal over many, many years in balancing the need to provide housing for the City of Dublin, and also to try and prevent encroachment into areas that are incompatible with aviation authority. So that's one step. Another part of that would be insulation schemes, building control standards. So that would come under that. So we did look at those aspects of it. And again, we came to the decision that that in itself wasn't going to address the issues for Dublin Airport. So the next stage is the start of the introduction of controls at an airport level. And we call these noise abatement operational procedures. So these would be like preferential routes in and out of the airport. Which way do you use the runways? What times do you use the runways? What way should the aircraft take off and land at an airport? These would all be things that affect the noise environment around the airport, but they don't limit an aircraft access in any way. And what the legislation says is controls, limits on aircraft can only be brought in as a last measure. And that last measure is an operating restriction. So an operating restriction is the final strand of the balanced approach. And examples of an operating restriction would be a movement cap, which was associated with the original grant of permission. Noise quotas is another one. Curfews on either a particular runway or the airport as a whole. And we took that additional step in our draft decision. So we're proposing an operating restriction that has the potential to limit aircraft activity in and out of Dublin Airport for the nighttime period. So we have gone through the steps of the balanced approach, and we have taken that final step of proposing an operating restriction. And this process is subject to oversight by the European Commission to make sure that we have gone through the process correctly. And that's what we have presented in our draft decision. So in a lot of our documents, you will see references to the balanced approach, and that's what it refers to. It's a process that's mandated in law that we must go through before we can impose any controls on an airport.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that comprehensive answer. Just before we go any further, we had a couple of questions or comments in the chat that people are having difficulties with sound. If you're having any difficulty with sound, can you please let us know through the Q&A box just by saying that there is no sound for you. It may be that the reception in your area is not great at the moment, but if it's widespread, we may need to be aware of it. So I'd appreciate if you'd let us know. With that, we'll move on to another question, and I'm going to return to the issue of the noise monitors for a moment. We've had a further question about that, which is, can James describe the noise monitor positions for the certified tests? James, would you mind answering that, please?
Sure, this is where a diagram would be really helpful, but there are effectively 3 positions that are used to do these measurements, and these measurements occur under standardized conditions. So it's reproducible, and it's essentially following a set of procedures that are set down by ICAO themselves. The first measurement position is called an approach certification point, and that's around about 2 kilometres from the end of the runway that the aircraft is arriving onto or landing onto. And then the other 2 positions are for departures, one which is 6.5 kilometres from the point the aircraft begins to take off directly under the flight path, and one which is around about 450 metres to the side of the runway at the end that it is flown over the top of on its departure. And it's those noise positions that are used to establish a noise level, which is then referenced against ICAO standards with respect to noise certification, and then is assigned to the aircraft in terms of its noise standard and associated noise level.
Thanks, James, for that clarification. Another question here, which I'm going to put to Joe, which are there anything is in the requirements you're proposing that look at the way various operators operate their aircraft, for example, acceleration altitudes, thrust reduction points, and so on?
As part of our assessment, ANCA looked at the noise mitigation measures that are currently in place for the airport, and also the ones that were proposed by the applicant. These weren't proposed by the application, and decision of the competent authority will have to be a legally binding planning condition on the applicant. So the way the aircraft operators operate their aircraft, that's something that has to be progressed and is being progressed between the airport operator, the airlines, and the air traffic control. It's not something that ANCA would have the authority to mandate on the airport, because it strays into spaces that are even beyond the airport's control. But they are areas that can impact on the noise climate around the airport. And what our decision will do, because we're prioritising noise over activity, it will incentivize, and it will more than just encourage the airport to chase down all these avenues to see how can they reduce the noise climate around the airport in a way that will achieve the objectives of the NAO. So we are aware that they are looking at those, and there are very positive things that can be done with how an aircraft is operated. So the airport is going to have to explore all those options to achieve the challenging noise abatement objective that we have set out.
Thanks, Joe. Another question here now from a member of the audience who said, on Appendix B of the aircraft noise consultation presenting quota count, it mentions the possibility of restricting operations to aircrafts of QC lower than 8. Is this QC, greater than 8, pardon me, is this QC limit value of 8 still under consideration, or is it to be put into the application provided approval of the planning? Joe, can I ask you to comment on that if you don't mind?
It's my actually, I'm going to let James take this. It's my understanding that QC8 is already prohibited from operating in the European Union. James can come in and correct me if I'm wrong on that. But we're proposing, yes. Yeah, what we're proposing here is a QC of 4 will be prohibited from landing at Dublin Airport. From taking off at Dublin Airport from the word go, and then that will be progressively reduced out to 2030. So over time, the European Union prohibits access to Europe for the noisiest aircraft. And Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are already prohibited from operating in the EU. But these prohibitions do take time, and we made the decision here in ANCA that we should be one step ahead on this and to prevent the noisiest possible aircraft from operating at night, because we do recognise that while our assessments are based on average noise, we do understand that people don't experience noise in an averaged way, and that the noise of an individual aircraft is a factor for people in the community. So this is our way of addressing it. And that's only possible through a QC scheme where we're prioritising noise over activity. So that's just one more step, and that's an extra step that ANCA took that wasn't proposed in the application, that we're proposing to straight away starting to phase out the noisiest aircraft and then progressively reduce that over time.
Thanks, Joe. James, is there anything you want to add to Joe's statements there, or will we move on to the next question?
That's quite right. We are setting, the application came in just to be clear on this, the quota system was proposed by the applicant. The one that ANCA has determined is different, and it's different in the sense that the quota scheme applies for 8 hours to cover the full night time period rather than a 6.5 hour period, which was promoted by the applicant. And secondly, as Joe just quite rightly mentioned, ANCA is proposing to set restrictions on the aircraft noise by event and aircraft in terms of their QC, in terms of arriving and departing, and progressively tighten that between now and 2030.
Thanks very much, James. So we have another question here now around noise monitoring data, and someone has asked, is there noise monitoring data publicly available since 2019? Joe, could you answer that?
Yes, the airport publishes a noise report both on a monthly and a quarterly basis. The quarterly reports are probably a little bit more informative, and again, we're working with the airport to try and build on those kind of reports to get as much information as possible. ANCA is very firmly of the view that as much information as possible should be available to anybody that wants to access it and wants to make informed decisions. And we have published a lot of information on our website. We've the last available noise exposure information is on the website of the EPA, and that goes back to 2016. So we published the noise exposure information for 2019 on our website, and people can go in and examine that right down to an individual property level. So what we've also done is we've worked with the airport to roll out a system called WebTrack. So WebTrack shows provides live information on the individual noise monitoring terminals, and that provides a facility for people to play back the information. So for instance, if somebody was woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they can play back that event the next day and see how that aircraft operated, and if they feel that it operated in a way that was not consistent with how the airport is supposed to operate, they can make a complaint in that system. So that's yet one more facility where people can engage and get information on aircraft noise. But certainly the noise exposure for 2019 is available on our website, on our maps. And I would encourage people to go in and look at the DAA noise reports too.
Thanks very much, Joe. So we'll move on to a slightly different area now for a moment. We've had a comment in here around the planning application submissions and the submissions for this consultation. As we know, the DAA placed a planning application and there have been submissions made on that. What is different about making submissions on the this piece of the consultation versus the planning application? Angela, can I go to you on that one, please?
Yep. Thank you, Roisin. They are two separate legal processes. So the submissions made on the planning application are assessed by the planning authority in determining the planning application, and ANCA assess those made in this public consultation are considered by ANCA. So if you want a submission to be considered by ANCA, do please submit in this public consultation period.
Thanks very much, Angela, for that clarification. So we've had another question now, which is when will the web track be made accurate for identifying planes over homes? Joe, can I put that one to you, please?
Yeah, there's a 1 hour delay on the data, and that's something that is beyond our control, and we would like to see it become near live. I think at most airports in the world it wouldn't be exactly live, it'd be near live. There'd be a very short lag on that. So WebTrack gets its information from the radar feeds that's owned and operated by the Irish Aviation Authority. And I do know that the airport are working with the IAA to see can that period be shortened. It was a very significant piece of progress to get it live, and it did need some work between those two authorities. But we understand that those two authorities are talking with a view to reducing that delay over time. But certainly the playback is available, so it's possible to play back and get information on any aircraft. But we do acknowledge that 1 hour is there, and it would be our hope that over time it'll be possible to get that lag reduced as much as possible.
Thanks, Joe, for that information. So we've had a question now about environmental factors and how those have helped to influence the NAO. I'm going to go to Toby for this one. Toby, if you wouldn't mind commenting as our environmental expert.
Yeah, of course, thank you. So in drafting the NAO and the RD, other environmental factors such as carbon, biodiversity, air quality, etc., have all been considered, and you'll see from the information that's provided as part of the consultation that a strategic environmental assessment report has been produced, as has a Natura impact statement where our appropriate assessment is documented. So of course, other environmental factors have influenced the drafting of the NAO and the RD and the specifics of that. I think interestingly is, of course, also to go back to what Joe said earlier on about ANCA's remit or lack of remit around other operating procedures. They have operating procedures that are put in place that influence the noise that's emitted, may also have other influences on other environmental factors as well. And so as a part of future planning applications and other consenting mechanisms, the environment will always be a consideration of any operating procedure that occurs.
Thanks, Toby, for that info. So we've had a couple of questions around this topic, and it's something we've had comments on social media and we want to address. So somebody has asked, why have we given the DAA everything that they have asked for and more in their application? Ethna, would you like to respond to that comment?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I suppose to preface my answer, I would like to say that you know, there were pre-planning meetings with the DAA, and certainly they would not have submitted something that was extraordinarily different to what we would have considered a workable solution. So following their submission, we would have had a fairly good grasp of what was coming in. And I suppose it's important to point out that we did not give them everything they requested. A lot of it aligned to what we thought was appropriate. But I suppose just a couple of examples of where we have been, in fact, more stringent. The first one would be the quota count mechanism. So the application from the airport considered a smaller period during the night for a quota count. In other words, to be regulated for a smaller period during the night. We felt it was more appropriate to regulate the airport for the entire night. In other words, we expanded the period of regulation within the quota count to go from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. instead of their request, which was to start at midnight and end at half past 6. So that's one thing. Another thing is the details of the installation scheme that we looked at are a little bit different to what they had proposed. And I suppose another example of something that we have implemented that was not suggested in the planning application is, and it's been mentioned a few times, is the prohibition on the QC flights. When an aircraft is QC4, it will not be permitted to take off. A QC2 will not be permitted to land, and that's straight away once the approval goes ahead, if the approval goes ahead. And then in 2030, we've made that even more stringent, that QC aircraft of 2 will not be permitted to take off from Dublin Airport, or QC1 will not be permitted to land. So I hope that answers the question, to give a kind of a broader sense that certainly we have not simply granted the airport what they have requested. We analysed in detail and determined the most appropriate method that they can work to.
Thanks, Ethna, that's great. So the issue of medical health and health experts has arisen, and it's something we were asked about in our last webinar. I wanted to address again this evening, which is the WHO say that night noise is damaging to people. How have we taken this into consideration, and what medical experts have been consulted? James, I'd like you to come in on this first, and if you'd like to pass to any other member of the team for further information, please do.
Sure. So I think the first thing to recognise is the way in which we have to assess the health consequences of noise is actually defined in the regulatory framework itself, and within the balanced approach regulation, within the environmental noise directive, and the way in which that has been extended to consider dose response relationships. That is essentially prescribed to us, and we essentially have to follow that. All of our assessments have considered all of the noise exposure from the WHO noise guideline and above. There is no written requirement to do that anywhere, but we have insisted and made the airport submit on that basis. So all of the health aspects essentially are set out to us in terms of the regulations, and we've followed that.
Thanks, James. That's really helpful. So we've had a couple of questions come in with concerns around the overall timeline for the changes at Dublin Airport. Ethna, would you like to make any comment around the timeline and how this will be implemented?
Yeah, just in terms of the timescale. So as I think everybody knows now, we're at public consultation and there's a statutory timeframe associated with that. The public consultation will end at the end of February, and we'll then assess all of the submissions that we receive, depending on the number and the content of those submissions really determines how long it will take our analysis to be carried out and to finalize the decision. Once that's done, and if we assume that they're just judging from what's coming in now, if we make the rough assumption that we'll be finished our part in ANCA by midsummer, we will then be handing over our decision to the planning authority. They then, though I can't speak on behalf of the planning department, but the planning authority, they will probably then, assuming all goes according to the time frame I just described, probably by the end of the summer. But again, that's not me committing because I can't commit on the part of the planning authority.
Thanks, Ethna. I know it's difficult to commit to timelines when we're not in charge of every part of it, so appreciate that clarity. We've had a question here now again around planning, which is many apartments have been built since the runway permission was granted. Rows of apartment blocks have been built parallel with noise contours east of the airport. Will the fact that those blocks are nearer to the aircraft generating noise mean that they are more impacted than two-storey houses? Joe, can I ask you to start in on that one? And if you'd like to bring anybody else in, please do.
Yeah, a lot has changed, I suppose, in terms of construction standards that will have very significant impacts on houses. So it's not as simple as to say that apartment blocks that are taller will experience more noise, particularly since 2019 stringent noise assessments have to be carried out on developments, and that would be the case with a lot of newer ones. Building control standards have also changed very significantly since the North Runway was granted planning permission, and a lot of building control standards that might be aimed at heat retention and the energy efficiency of a building will also have the benefit of protecting the inhabitants of those buildings against sound. So it wouldn't be correct to compare one type of building with another. To generalize, older houses might have poorer insulation and noise might be a bigger issue in them. So certainly newer buildings that have been built, they should be built to a higher standard than may have been the case back when the planning permission was granted. But certainly there are new standards in the development plans now to ensure that developments built in areas that are affected by aircraft noise have measures designed into them to mitigate against those the effects of that noise.
Thank you very much for that, Joe. So the next question is around the QC system and why was this chosen instead of numbers of flights? So I'm going to go to Ethna on that one, please.
Yeah, sure. I suppose to put it in a nutshell, the use of a quota count incentivizes the airport or encourages the airport who then incentivize the airlines to modernize their fleet to more quieter aircraft. Because that essentially allows for growth if they have to, stay within their budget. So it is really a useful tool to modernize, to encourage the modernization of fleets and quieter aircraft. On the other hand, with a sort of a numbers count, a movement count, there is no motivation there to reduce the noise or modernize the fleet. And what could be the case that would occur there is that Airlines that have a mixed fleet might end up sending their noisier aircraft to Dublin Airport because of the fact that there's no significant penalty involved in doing that. So really, I suppose, to put it in another way, measuring aircraft movements is a rather blunt instrument to control noise. It's kind of an on-off button, and it really doesn't look into the future climate, the future noise climate of the airport.
Thanks very much for that, Ethna. Just a brief reminder again to keep putting your questions into the Q&A. We're delighted to see so many coming in, and we're hopeful that we're answering them adequately. We're doing our best to do so. As I said, any questions that we don't get to this evening, if that's the case, we will pass all of the transcript on to the team, and they'll be able to read them and review them in their consideration process as they continue work on the consult. And as I said, for anyone who maybe has to leave the meeting early or can't stay with us, we will be recording, and we'll have the recording of this meeting available on the website within the coming days, probably before the end of this week. We've also had a comment there in from a member of the public saying they're having difficulty accessing the consultation. Just to clarify, that's www.consult.fingal.ie. Within that portal, you'll find access to all of the ANCA documents. We haven't found a technical issue with it at this end, but if there is something wrong, we will endeavour to resolve it as quickly as possible. You can also find all that documentation on the Fingal website, so fingal.ie/aircraft noise CA, if you're interested in reading any of those documents at this time or a later date when you work on your submission. And consult.fingal.ie, as I said, is the correct place to go to make a submission with a piece that will guide you right through that as you need to go. So we've had a question in here now while I've been chatting there about the buyout scheme. Ethna, can I ask you to make some comment on the buyout scheme and how that works, please? Actually, sorry, I'm going to go to Joe on that one first. Pardon me.
I'll pick up that. Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of schemes that were implemented as part of the Regional Grant of Permission report. There were 2 home insulation schemes. There was a school insulation scheme, and there was also a voluntary purchase of dwelling scheme. So ANCA did look at that at the time. The condition associated with that aspect of the planning application didn't form part of the applicant's proposal, but nonetheless ANCA did look at it, and we considered that we felt that the thresholds for that scheme applying remained relevant today, and that we support that, and that it will continue to have effect into the future as noise changes around Dublin Airport. So homes that may not currently be in it, if the noise in the area changes significantly, that brings additional houses into it, that will continue to have effect. So it remains undisturbed as such by our decision, and it continues to have effect.
Thanks very much, Joe. We have another question here now around aircraft and they're generating less noise. Is it expected that the work that ANCA is doing here will continue to incentivize airlines to use less noisy aircraft in the coming years? Joe, can I put that question to you if you don't mind?
Yeah, we believe that it will, and we believe it's something that can't be achieved overnight. But we fundamentally believe that unless we start the airport on that path, there's no incentive for them to go that route. That aircraft have a long shelf life and will continue to be, the older, noisier aircraft will continue to be deployed wherever there is a home for them. And we're hoping that Dublin won't be that place. So for the very first time, by prioritising noise as opposed to activity, we do believe that the airport will have to focus on that to deliver their performance that will achieve the objectives of the objectives that we have set out for the airport, but fully appreciating it can't happen overnight, and that's why we have built upon some of the measures to mitigate the noise in the shorter term, and we have added a few more in this one, and then put the incentives in place to make sure that noise is reduced. So this is very much a health outcomes focused decision, but it is one way of managing the noise, and the purpose of this consultation is for people to suggest other ways if that's what they would like to do it. But we do believe it will set the airport on a path of reducing noise exposure over time, and putting in place incentives to make sure that the quietest planes will be based in Dublin and will come through Dublin.
Thanks very much, Joe. So we've had another question in here now around ground noise, and has ground noise testing been considered, or how is it being conducted in the process? James, could I ask you to come in on that? I know you may need to bring in some of your colleagues on this one as well.
No, it's fine. So the things like engine testing, etc. There's no. There was a ground noise assessment which was submitted by the airport, which we have looked at. I think in terms of the decision that ANCA is making and looking at that more broadly, it was quite clear from our analysis that the way in which the runways were being used and the activity on those and on the flight paths was going to be the overriding factor as to the noise led decision on operating modes and restrictions, etc. Ground noise aspects such as the ground engine testing and that sort of thing is something that ANCA obtains information from the airport as part of the compliance reports that are submitted to it, and certainly all forms of noise producing activity like that are things that ANCA is interested in.
Thanks, James. And I'd just also add to that that the original grant of permission did address part of the ground engine testing, and there was a requirement for the facility to be moved away from close to South Swords to an area in the middle of the airfield and to be appropriately bonded, and that happened before the commencement of the development of the North Runway. So there's also controls on there's a number of existing noise mitigation measures in place for Dublin Airport that are unrelated to either the original grant of permission or this regulation. And there are limits on the hours where engine testing can happen in Swords, at the airport. And the airport does report on that as part of their annual compliance report.
Thank you very much, Joe. Oh, pardon me, my mic just took a moment to come back there. Thank you very much for that answer. So we are starting to come to the end of the presentation. Ethna, I'd like to go to you now if you'd like to make any final comments around the work of ANCA and this consultation for all of those who've joined us this evening.
Yes, thank you, I suppose, firstly, for joining us for our webinar tonight. Though we're not in person in a room, it does give a sense that people are really very interested in what we're doing, and that's extremely important for this process. So at the huge risk of repeating myself, if we can really encourage you to submit your thoughts and suggestions, proposals for any aspect that you think might improve this decision. The decision will affect all of us, because I should say most of us, because most of us are users of the airport, but it will also, as we are very, very well aware, affect the lives of pretty much everybody that lives in the locality of the airport. And we really want to balance that and take that into consideration. So any views you have, as I say, please submit them. One comment did suggest, I think, that there was difficulty getting into the portal. If that continues, certainly contact us here in ANCA in the office. It's the first, and I think it's the only concern that was mentioned to us. So certainly we would like to help you get through that if that's an issue. Again, my sincere thanks to everybody that's attended, and to the very willing and helpful team in the ANCA group here. I won't name them all, but certainly we're available at your disposal to assist with any questions you might have in advance of completing your submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ethna, and again, thank you to our audience who joined us this evening. My thanks also to Mark Broderick, who produced this webinar and to such high quality. We'd like to remind you that the submission window does remain open until February 28th, so that's another few weeks to go. Only written submissions received through the portal are considered valid, and we have had a fantastic, exciting engagement throughout this webinar and the last one, and online over the last number of weeks. So we'd really like to see that translated into submissions for those of you who feel that you have issues you'd like to raise or queries you would like to have answered or addressed in the consultation. We'd be very welcome and open to receiving your submissions and look forward to reading them.
And I just said that the portal is where we are encouraging everybody to get involved, but we do understand that not everybody may have access to the internet. The portal provides access to all the documentation associated with the draft decisions that we've made. But if there is anybody that doesn't have access to the internet, we have either an email address or they can be sent in by post. All the email ones and the ones that come in by post will be entered into the portal by us. So the portal will be the full account, and that will be the open and transparent method of for everyone to see the submissions that have been made. But we do want to make sure that everybody is accommodated in this.
Thanks, Joe, for that very important introduction. So with that in mind, we'll wrap up the meeting for this evening. As I said, the session has been recorded and it will be put on the website in the coming days. And the recording of the last webinar from November 17th is also up there and available to view now. Those of you who've attended this evening, because you've given us your email address, we will circulate a link to that recording as soon as it's available live. And thank you again for your sincere engagement and your involvement in the process. We really look forward to reading your submissions. Thanks and good night.